Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Change is a scary word for most of us. However, when humans have been in crisis, that's also very often the time to bring out the best in us, COVID not being an exception. We seem to possess a psychological tendency to tap into our deeper potential, our real skills, our real self in times of distress. So, are we wired for change? And contrary to traditional thinking, does it affect our health actually positively? Is change even immunotherapy for life? And are we all change makers without knowing it? That's what we'll explore tonight. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Let me start by asking you, did you have enough change during the course of last year? Or do you think most of it is still ahead? Fact is, change is accelerating still. In the last few years, we've seen more and more that how we live our lives, how our society is built, how we see our role is not really what most of us intuitively feel could be the best way humans can live their lives going forward. Inequalities have gotten bigger. The divide between rich and poor is growing. The bottom line-driven economy is not a thriving one for the future. The environment is screaming, we need to do something. Local communities have gotten a new role. Work has changed forever. Few, in fact, want to go back to the way it was before. Many of the systemic flaws are coming to the forefront, and illusions in our thinking based on artificial separations, like, for example, dividing life and work into two separate things, have become more obvious. 63%, according to a study, of Americans want change. But how does it happen? Who makes it happen? In The Atlantic on July 4, there was an article about how COVID has affected us. Now, the common narrative has been that our mental health has suffered. Laura Agnon, psychology professor at Simon Fraser University and chair of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Task Force for the Lancet's COVID-19 Commission, together with Jamil Saki, professor of psychology at Stanford, and Elizabeth Dunn, also psychology professor at the University of British Columbia, say the pandemic, though, has been a test of the global psychological immune system, which appears more robust than we would have guessed. And there are many examples in history when human beings have not been passive victims of change, but became active stewards of their own well-being once they accepted the call. So knowing all this, have we arrived at a place where everyone steps up to co-create the society we want to live in? How does change-making, driving change, flowing with change affect our brain and boost our health? Let's talk with Catherine Bond, a global health specialist who has led major initiatives in federal government, philanthropic, academic, and nonprofit organizations. She develops network-based strategies that support positive change and improve health outcomes. Bob Sporer, Chief People Entrepreneur for Ashoka, Innovators for the Public, that have advocated for decades about the power of change and our ability to make it. Melanie Taylor, she's a PhD, a social psychologist, and president of the Center for Executive Development. She specializes in leadership development and focuses on building strategic and sustainable solutions to complex global issues. And we have Kara Andrade, a senior change leader at Ashoka. She's an Ashoka Fellow and Fulbright Scholar and co-founded Habla Centro Informatics NFP and LLC, a network of citizen journalism and information sharing hubs in Latin America that shared reliable and timely updates from the ground up during the crisis. Welcome all of you to Smart Sustainability. It's great to have you on, and I do see everyone on camera. So, there's a lot of talk about change, and Bob, I want to start with you because there's so much talk about change and change making. Let's start with clarifying what is actually change making.
Thanks, Nicolette, I'm sorry. How are you? I think the best way to describe it is, that it's a person who sees patterns, sees challenges, sees opportunities that are different from what the normal information might be, and thinks about ways to solve the problem or create a better system or to improve a condition. Builds a team and then actually takes action to make that change happen. So the emphasis is on making the change happen, because without that, it's somewhat theoretical, right? So a change maker is, really focused on helping to bring about a new reality with their own idea.
And act on it, exactly. So Melanie, under what circumstances do we actually want to make change to begin with? Are there certain prerequisites for us to want to make change?
Well, thanks, Nicolette. Yes, there are, certain circumstances occur when we see things. So for instance, like a bullying situation, and we want to step in and we want to take, agency to actually correct that. When we see situations that are going wrong, or situations that impact us emotionally or psychologically, we want to step in and make the change. And we saw a lot of evidence for that, Nicolette, during the pandemic. We saw people on their own time taking their own free initiative to help others, to freely engage in acts of kindness, generosity, compassion, and care, where we can actually have an impact on our community or on others with whom we have proximity. We saw neighbors helping elderly, vulnerable people. We saw people giving donations. So where we can have impact, we do take agency when we have some other things in that, such as empathy for the situation. So there are times where we will step up and actually act, as Bob says.
So I do have a question. I'm going to call on you, Catherine, on this one. So what is the difference between making change and adapting to change? Because what we just heard is there's a lot of it, we've all adapted to change. We became creative. We tapped into more of our inner potential. But is there a difference between making change and adapting change, or adapting to change?
That's a very interesting question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Adaptive change, I think, tends to start with from a reactive place, a place of reactivity, recognizing a situation's challenges, having patterns of response, some of which can improve a situation, some of which keep the situation going into a cycle. But active change making comes with a sense of vision or aspiration for what can be better. And from that vision, then, as Bob has been able to say, identifying strategies through which to activate it, bringing the right people together, creating the kinds of dynamics of trust and strong relationship building, which in and of itself then does change the situation. So the change ultimately starts from within, as opposed to relying on our old patterns of response to a situation that is imposed upon us.
So, Cara, you're a change maker in a way. You started with citizen journalism. Explain to our viewers a little bit what actually drove you. How did you know in your heart of hearts that this is something you wanted to change? How did you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think the main thing is that, one, you really feel like you can change things in your reality, right? And I think that in itself is the biggest part of change making, is it's really feeling like you are an agent, that like you can actually actively play that role, right? And I think for me, like having, I was born in Guatemala and I immigrated to the United States, and I became a journalist early on in my career, and I felt that the way that journalists see the world really makes us very active in shaping and changing the reality. And so for me, I was like, wow, like, this has really shaped the way that I think about my role in life, both professionally and personally. And could we also get other people to see themselves, playing this role that the journalists play in society, both as like, kind of watchdogs, but also really participatory, right? Where there's this process of where, you don't feel like the reality is happening to you. Like you really feel like you're shaping reality, and that, you can author things. And so I think that's, for me, when I started to feel like, I could actually take these skills as a journalist that I had changed my life, and I could take them back to Guatemala and help people in a country that has a very fragile democracy, and get them to use these same tools and this, more than anything, this way of thinking about things to change what's happening on the ground, right?
But did you just wake up one morning and figure like, I'm going to do something about this, or was this a process? Walk us through quickly. How long from start to finish did you think about this? How did you actually then find the guts to just do it?
Yeah. Yeah, you're asking me to give you the secret sauce, but
yes, I do.
I'll do it. I mean, it really isn't a secret sauce. There's like a lot of different ingredients, and it's no linear path, right? I think people really, it's very much a continuum, and people really have to step into it. But I think the most important ingredient is empathy, right? And then in Ashoka, we really focus a lot on empathy and going back to that cognitive empathy that helps you really step into, the situation that people are dealing with and the problems that they're dealing with, and then really help go, kind of help think through the different solutions to solving those different problems that people are dealing with. But you always keep that in mind, like how does what I'm about to do, like the things that I'm thinking about, help someone, right? And that could it's not just you, right? How can it just help others? And so I think it really goes back to empathy. And so a lot of the work that we do at Ashoka, for that reason, I think goes back to that root cause. And I think the second thing that's super important for us is like, and I kind of did it very intuitively, and partly because it's something that you do as a journalist, right? You kind of always go back to looking at, okay, so, we're seeing all these different things coming up, like, all these different problems, but like, is there like a root problem? Like, where is it all coming from, right? And so I think you start to teach yourself how to identify those root problems, which is what you really have to get to really change reality and what we refer to in Ashoka as a systemic kind of change, and also how people even think about that problem, right, and how they respond to it. So I think it's like a muscle, right? It's like every day. It's like when you go to the gym, when you first get in the gym, you're like, oh, I'm really out of shape, right? But if you're constantly doing little acts of change making in your life, from as early as I don't know. I mean, we really want to get people as young as possible. When you really start teaching them, they're like, you can do things to change what's happening, right, to you and to others. Then you start to do it constantly, right? And then it just becomes a way of being, right? So there is no special, like secret sauce.
What I've been hearing from everyone here, there are two areas we need to focus on. So it's the heart in a way, where you have empathy, love, feeling connected to one another. And the other one is the self, the act, the daring part of it. How do we go out and just do it? So we went out yesterday and interviewed people on the street. We actually have a brief video clip to play and see what people were thinking about change and change making, and where this all falls into place. Let's have a look.
How do you react to the word change? Is there a positive feeling or a negative feeling?
Oh, usually anxiety first, calm second, research third.
Okay, so that sounds like a very logical approach. Do you feel that you make a lot of changes in your life?
I do not. My life is pretty steady, but change is not unwelcome. It's just the first thing that I do is get anxious about it.
Think we need more change in America or in communities?
Absolutely, because change is what keeps you moving and growing and become new, bigger, and better things, right? I mean, nothing can stay the same, correct? The river doesn't stay the same, the ocean doesn't stay the same, the air quality doesn't stay the same. Of course we need change.
So if you could change one or two things, what would those be? And it could be anything in your personal life or in your work life or in communities, how we live, or in a grander outlook. What would you change?
I would just want people to be nicer to each other. I would want people to treat people with all of that means with humanity. You know, I would just want people to be nicer to each other. That's the biggest change. Everybody's so concerned about themselves. If we could think of ourselves more as a community, that would be all the change we would need.
So how do you think we could make this happen?
I'm not sure.
What are you doing to make it happen?
I volunteer. But everybody is a change maker, aren't they?
That's a good question. I don't know. You think so?
I wouldn't think that, yeah, of course, because a coach could change somebody's life. Me giving you a cup of coffee when you really need it could change your day, which changes someone else's life. It's small and incremental, so anybody could be a change maker.
How do you feel about change, generally?
I think it's really the only constant we have, right? That's what people say. It's undeniable that you're going to come out in a couple of years and you can look around and see whether it's buildings, whether it's the people in the neighborhood, everything is changing. And I think if you're on board with it and, you help make it go in the right direction, then change can be a really good thing, really powerful.
So when you think about change, you don't shiver or get afraid. You take more of an active role.
Yes, yeah, because we decide every day, like the collective human, like groups, we try and achieve our goals, and there's a lot to be done. Honestly, we could do better.
Do you see yourself in the driver's seat of change? So knowing that you can, if there's something in your life or in your environment that you want to change, you're able to do it?
Yeah. There's small things. Getting involved in really even something small to a stranger could be huge. People had some time to think during COVID, and I know the job market's what everyone talks about. It's really changed and trying to find people to work these jobs. But I think people want to see that they can change their own lives.
What do you feel about change generally?
I think it can be good, scary sometimes, but overall good.
What about you?
Depends on what you're asking for change. Sometimes change is good, and sometimes change is bad. It really just depends.
So when you hear the word change, do you have like a certain reaction just when you hear the word?
I mean, when I hear the word, I'm a little apprehensive.
And so when you look at where we're at currently in terms of environment and going sort of into the 21st century, when you think about change, do you think that we're in the driver's seat or that change is just happening to us?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we need to take a more active role in the change in our environment, because there's obviously a lot happening with climate change and stuff, and we need to be more aware, more proactive about this kind of stuff.
Identify yourself or see yourself as a change maker?
That's a tough one. I mean, I'd like to say yes, but I don't know.
So what is it to you?
Just anyone that is influencing anything, I guess, in certain senses. I don't know, like a leader, I guess is what I would associate it with. But
so what's a change maker to you?
I'd say my girlfriend. I mean, she makes change everywhere she goes, and I really appreciate her for that. I mean, everywhere in her workplace, she tries to make everything better. She tries to innovate. She tries to make it more inclusive for everybody else. I really appreciate her for that, and I think that's a real change maker to me.
Would she self-identify as a change maker?
She probably wouldn't. She probably would not. And I feel like that's how most people go. I don't think they would identify, even though they are. And I mean, I think I appreciate her for that too, being humble.
And that's the quintessence of it, which really it goes very much in line of what we talked a little bit about it. So there is obviously an inner need for humans to do something positive in the community, but we're all not quite sure in terms of how to do this. So let's tackle this here. Let's start with, what does when we make change, what does it actually do to our brain? Bob, can you tell us what exactly happens to the brain? What is it that kicks us off, that we like about this, and keep going on that?
Well, it starts with an idea, and an idea, has blood flow to your frontal cortex and connects with the thing that you, as Kara and Melanie and Kate were saying, is sort of your empathy for making things better. And you bring those two together and come up with an idea that then you have a plan to sort of carry out. This raises, sort of parts of what are good things in your body, such as, immunoglobulin, endorphins, oxytocin, these kinds of hormones that get you geared up to take action. And then actually, as you do that, you work with others, you share your ideas, you mold them, you shape them, you get input, and then of course, then it's about taking action on it and making it happen. So in a sense, it's kind of finding your power. And that power is not something I think that's just abstract. I do believe that power is your immune system itself that can actually be boosted by the things you're doing that create positive change. I know in college, I was very active on the issue of apartheid in South Africa. And I saw, of my peers, colleagues, they were going to protests. And I said, gee, I there's something I should be able to do about this. And, I came up with the idea, well, what if I got the, university to divest its financial holdings in South Africa? That would probably make the alumni give more, probably make the, applications go up, probably get, a positive impact on the world. It's good for everybody, and actually got this, the school administration and what we call the Senate and the Board of Trustees to accept this, and it happened. And we actually changed the first university, Columbia University, to take this action, and it made a difference in terms of the real lives of those who were facing apartheid, and the system was ended after 3 or 4 years, not just because of this, but it was a contributing factor. And I think that's really the two things that come into play: this sense of caring, which is, and that, sort of activates your, empathy, and contributing. A sense of contributing activates your frontal cortex, which involves decision making, sort of sometimes impulse control, long range planning. Those are all things that your body needs to be active so you can keep healthy.
There is another component to it, though, I think, and I think you touched a little bit on it when you talked about it, and that's so when you make change and you're successful with it, there's a positive experience to it. So how would that shape you then for being confident that you would feel good and know I can make another change if I need to?
Yes. So Nicolette,
yeah.
Let me jump in this here. So you're absolutely right. It's what we call the helper's high. Right, so and it's defined by when we help others, we actually bring happiness to ourselves. So it reinforces us when we do something good just by actually helping someone. We have, as Bob said, this significant neurological change, but it also makes us feel better about ourselves. And this has been researched by folks at Harvard and NIH and Emory University. So clearly we're wired for being compassionate to others because there is also a benefit to ourselves. And here's the great news to that those kinds of pro-social behaviors, while they impact us individually, they also impact us collectively, because those pro-social behaviors are contagious, just like the virus. So there is, according to social contagion theory, when we see others acting out of compassion, helping others, doing good for others, we ourselves become motivated to do those sorts of things. So there's a contagion that goes through the community of these types of behaviors, which I think is absolutely very powerful at the community level.
Yeah. Catherine, from your experience, do you need to have a certain disposition for actually experiencing this positive behavior, or is this actually, have you observed that this is happening to everyone when they do this or when they engage?
Well, I think people have different ways of expressing it, but it is a human trait to express compassion and to act. And we can see across the world how people engage in these kinds of acts of generosity and compassion and making change more systemically in different ways.
But we usually see it only when there's a crisis or when there's something happening. So how do we actually move it so that we don't just wait for a crisis, but we could actually have that, as some of our interviewees also said there in the tape, how can we actually have this every day? Why can we not have it every day?
Well, I would suspect that it's there. Maybe we only hear about it in the context of crises, or that's where it tends to be more public. But I think every day, as many of the people interviewed expressed, simple acts in the workplace, in the neighborhood, in volunteer associations, in their wider communities. I think it's in us, and we probably could do with shining more of a spotlight on these behaviors. Because as Melanie says, we know that if we're exposed to people, either in our immediate environment or even up to 3 degrees, so we're sort of friends, we're going to be more likely to act with care and compassion, and more likely to contribute.
So it's the 3 3s?
So Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler, who are network scientists, have demonstrated impacts through 3 degrees in terms of cooperation, but also impacts on health directly. So we can, as you were asking, how does this affect us individually? Well, it affects us in the hormones we produce. It affects it in our health behaviors, whether or not we're engaging in healthy nutrition, exercise, stress management, mental health. But that's also clustered. That happens through these connections that we build, hence the value of being in support groups, the value of having mentors or other people who are positively supporting and reinforcing what we're doing that's good for our health and for our community.
Now, are there certain ways in how we learn, and I know Bob is very adamant about this, he shared with us also some data on this, in terms of are we better disposed to be more empathetic, to utilize more of these 3-on-3 connections, to network better, if we have certain childhood experiences necessarily like in a positive way, or can they also be in a negative way? So anyone who wants to jump in, you want to take the first stab on this? Go.
I'll start, because it's a very interesting question, and it really speaks to this question of resilience. We can have negative experiences, but if we give ourselves a positive narrative about that, and we can recognize that there are things either people did to support us or that we did to share with others, that really changes the trajectory, and that has more impact on our longer term mindset and approach than the actual experience itself. So I find that very hopeful, actually.
I do too, and I think actually this gives us tremendous power that I think most of us, or our viewers, were actually not necessarily tapping into this power very much to really frame the narrative on this one. Melanie, I want to ask you on that aspect as well, because from a psychological sense, in reframing a certain narrative, there is a process that goes with that, is it not?
Yes, and it begins with understanding the narrative where you are, right? And then understanding the alternative narratives that you could give yourself to experience, to process the experience differently. It's also a matter of understanding the emotional aspect of the experience, but also the lessons learned and the takeaways. So it's a journey. It's a journey of a process, and it is, as you said, an extraordinarily powerful one where you take power of that narrative, right? So it puts you in the driver's seat for how that experience will shape you.
But can everyone do this on their own, or do we need help with that? Because I can think of tons of examples of why people need help with that. It's really difficult to do because there's so many modalities and submodalities and the consciousness and the subconsciousness and things like that. What is the general take on that?
Part of it.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, part of it is parents, right? The studies are showing that, babies as young as 13 months old are 2 times more likely to sort of attempt to achieve a goal when they see their parents actually doing the same thing, that their parents are very open about their trying to achieve something. That's what kids are drawn to. So the more open the parent is about the way they're experiencing challenges, and the way they sort of open up and how they do it can give their kids or their obviously other people that are impacted by them in the family that kind of same kind of narrative that they can choose to use for themselves as they fight life battles.
Yeah, and we actually have, we have an image of this one that we can just show, and maybe you can walk us through that one, that little graphic with the babies and how we learn and how we take experiences from it. Can we see that? Not coming on yet.
Well, yeah, it's as they say, the child observes the parent struggling to do a task and trying different ways to get the bottle cap open, and maybe they sort of then dry their hand and open the bottle cap, right? That's what draws the kids in versus doing it somewhere where the kid does everything is perfect and they don't see that struggle. That's sort of what you're seeing here, where the parent is kind of showing the child what they're doing to achieve something, and then the child imitates it and does the same thing. And the more they sort of persist towards taking action towards the goal, the more likely they're going to get to the goal. Once they get to that goal, of course, that changes the physiological nature of the child's, that connects that emotional center to their, cognitive center.
So what happens to kids that do not, for example, have a parent that spends that kind of time or gives the child that kind of attention for that? Are we then, who didn't experience that, lost cases?
No.
Well, there's so many more other ways. Community groups can help, connect young people to projects. The studies show you're much more, positive life outcomes, the number of non-family member, adults in a young person's life. And how does that come about? Well, the young person might have an idea to, stop bullying in the community or improve the water supply or reduce the bee migration or the declining of bees in their community. These are things that if society and community, create these opportunities and experiences for young people to dig into, whether it's at school or at a neighborhood activity. I think during COVID, there were drive-by birthday parties and different kinds of ways to get food to people that were especially affected by these things openly, visibly really affect the others that, everyone involved in it, and they can start sort of seeing the same thing for themselves.
So we talked a little bit about the emotions, we talked a little bit about the experience and the upbringing, we talked a little bit about our ability to frame the narrative. Now when we think of ourselves as you wanting to change something, you have the love and you have the compassion, you become a doer, or you try to become a doer, what role plays risk-taking or a positive attitude to risk-taking in this whole scenario? And can we learn it? Bob, do you want to go?
Well, risk-taking, positive risk-taking, I think is what really matters, because even if you don't succeed, you're making an attempt to improve a situation. When it's risk-taking that's maybe, more negative or unhealthy, that actually has the reverse. And so the more on the positive side, the best educational, program in the world is the best educational program for the world. So when you're enabling people to improve on a situation, that's no longer so scary as a risk, because you're only going to get better at getting better. And that's what that kind of mental muscle, I think, that we've all talked about. Really, the more you do it young, the more likely it becomes erases the genes that might say I can't do this, or I don't have the background to do this, or I have these constraints. Those get lifted, and what we're seeing in the studies we've done is young people who take positive action, creative action, and bring about a significant result are 3 times more likely to be a CEO. They're 3 times more likely to be a top leader. They're 4 times more likely to be an entrepreneur. And as we all know, in the world of change, the sort of best way to combat it is to change it, right? So this is our future. And, I think that's where sort of rubber meets the road.
Yep. Catherine, you had something to add?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about risk. What do we really mean by risk? I think for many, starting out, the risk is either an individual taking initiative and failing, or being afraid to fail, or perhaps the risk is a societal risk, pointing out things that aren't as good as they could be, or where there are injustices, or where there are problems, and kind of the fear that others will either not recognize it or shame them for trying to do something to change it. And I think that's where the cognitive functions that Bob was referring to, in terms of being able to know the problem, make the case, be able to articulate your point, be able to trust in your instinct that you can actually do something better, and bring people on board with you, is really part of what that exercising also entails. And then when you begin to do that, you break down that skepticism, or that sense that perhaps what we're trying to do isn't possible, but it's actually possible, and it's going to be better. And I think those are some of the things that we as grown-ups in the world trying to support younger people to build this muscle have to keep in mind.
I want to inject one important thing, I think, with all this. So when we talk about putting yourself out there, becoming visible in a way when you stand up for something, right? What role does trauma play on that? Because we know that people who have experienced trauma, and I think at this point it's fair to say that most of us actually have experienced some sort of trauma, then how does this shape our ability to put ourselves out there and to be visible and to stand up for what you believe and really have a voice in that? Do you have something to add to this one?
I think we can look at trauma as either a trigger, and for many, suffering of one sort or another is the trigger to be more empathetic to others' conditions and other situations. I think that's the positive trajectory, that if somebody has that trauma, they build that sense of empathy. They recognize they're not alone. They find people with whom they can connect and care and contribute moving forward. I think where it's a problem is when people are really isolated, and that sort of experience then tends to spiral or repeat. And that's again why we need our sense of connection to help us shift that narrative and create a new path forward, neural path as well as a life trajectory.
Yeah. Melanie, you got something to add on this one?
So on trauma, in my field, we would talk about, the path out of trauma being, a slow one, more along the lines of systematic desensitization, where we take small steps towards to reaching our end goal. But I want to reinforce what Kate has said, that, having community around to support you out of that, that narrative, if you will, is an important part of recovery. And these are difficult terms, but it's the reframing of that experience in a way that gives you more agency over its impact on you. That is the key there. And like everything else in terms of human behavior, Nicolette, all human behavior is learned. From the very first behavior we learn as infants, once we are born, the rooting reflex or behavior is learned, right? So everything we do, every behavior we know in life is learned. But our repertoires are solidified through practice, right? So as Kate is talking about, these kinds of behaviors need to be practiced over time, even at the individual level, but also at the community level, right? The communities that practice these kinds of behaviors, community support behaviors, are better off. Individuals who provide these kinds of, who practice these behaviors out of their trauma, the reframing behaviors out of their trauma, are better off.
Cara, we talked before about risk-taking, and I want to ask you, did you ever think about failing when you started your citizen journalism thing? Were you even thinking of risk when you did it?
Well, I've been thinking about this. It's such a great conversation. And just kind of put in my thinking in here on the things that were just discussed is like, I think with risk-taking and trauma, I do feel like risk-taking behavior that comes out of trauma can be harmful or dangerous. And I think a lot of people who come from trauma have that very reactive, when there hasn't been like the work, where you kind of make sense of the trauma, I think you kind of react from that instinctual place, and sometimes PTSD. And so I think there's that aspect of risk-taking, right? But there's also like, I've been reading Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets. And she's a PhD in psychology, but she became a gambler, a professional gambler for a few years, and then like she writes this book, and it really resonated with me because my mother was a gambler for many years, and I would always ask her, I was like, how do you know when to bet? Like how do you know when to bet what, right? And so I think it really is a matter of learning how to be confident in your decision making, right? And so it's not just risk taking. It's like because a lot of the risks that we take are going to have negative results. But it's like, what do you do with that, right? And so there's like this element of confidence of like, okay, look, I'm going to risk this. It's going to be like maybe a calculated risk. I'm going to weigh out the different aspects to it, and then I'm going to go skydiving with this parachute that might actually like not work, 22% of the time. And so I think like if you have, as it goes back to the muscle, as you keep using it, your confidence builds, right? So if you have, you start doing these little exercises where, okay, I might fail at this, but like you keep doing it and you're still able to recover, your confidence starts to build, and your decision making also starts to, you start to get smarter about how you make your decisions, right? And so I think, like, for me, to your question about, that I consider the failure, factor in in what I was doing with the Shukka and the fellowship, it didn't even factor in. it just was something I had to do, right? It's like I found this way of making sense of the world, and it was effective. It continues to be effective for me, and I wanted to teach others to do it. It wasn't like I never even considered failure an option.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about two more things here. We heard a lot about taking agency, and I want to clarify this for viewers, because I think most of our viewers, including myself when I heard this the first time, just so you know, you're not alone. The question is, okay, so what does taking agency actually mean? So let's clarify that, and then we move on to building the muscle for taking agency and building compassion, which both we have to train, obviously, and learn. Let's start with taking agency. What does that mean exactly when we talk about that? Catherine, you want to take that? Oh, yeah, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, there's really three components of agency taking, one of which is that you're taking in information and then you make a decision as to, okay, is this something status quo and I just keep moving on? Or no, actually, this isn't really status quo. There's something not quite right here, and I'm going to sort of do something about it. So that's sort of the first step, is your cognitive processing about information that might be happening, and then you actually take action. You sort of project yourself into the situation by again, building a team, organizing activity, and then the third phase is all the sort of say decisions you have to make in order to achieve the goal that you think will be helping you solve the problem that you saw in the first place. And a lot of times you have to take different steps in order to do that, to get there. Because again, back to the Columbia University example, which I didn't mention the first time, is I failed pretty miserably the first time. I mean, I put out a resolution with the University Senate and said, this is our moral obligation to do something about it. And it was sort of like 3 votes to 98. 98 were against, and like three people. And then I changed it, and I said, well, okay, what if I put in the university context of this might actually improve our reputation, obviously make a difference in the world. When my giving goes up, maybe more applications go up, so more, overall. And of course, if they do divest their stocks in these companies, they're probably going to have a better better performing stock portfolio. And that passed, right? But that's what then got to the trustees to adopt it. If it wasn't for that back and forth persistence in the face of constant objection or even the big rejection I faced, that's what agency. That's a component of agency taking that really leads to the grit or resilience that people talk about. And that's always the hard part. And, it's just one of those things that makes a difference.
Yep. Catherine, do you have something to add on this one?
I think, the idea that we act as individuals in isolation is maybe a false one. Much of where we get our motivation and our impetus to act actually comes from those around us, and from recognizing there's a situation that warrants us to act. So as Bob was a student, he saw a problem on the other side of the world, but recognized he was in a place where there were resources where he could advance that case, and with persistence and continuing action, make major change and really be part of a broader movement. So I think that when we talk about agency, we tend to think, oh, this is about the individual's action, but it actually is part of being a member of society as well.
So it means taking action for the greater good, which actually brings me then to the next point. We have about 8 minutes left, and I do want to talk a little bit about building muscle. How do we do this? I know you're working on a project. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks. Well, as we all know, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, our ticket to relative normalcy and to being able to connect with our loved ones is the vaccine. I feel immensely privileged that we live in an area where we have over 80% coverage of those eligible for vaccines. However, many of my colleagues around the world who work in global health are waiting. We've lost amazing health workers to COVID, who were pillars, at the level of continent in building a workforce, in making change in a system in health. And I was fortunate a few months ago to reconnect with a colleague, former colleague, who had this great idea. Well, why don't we, if we get one, why don't we give one? So she initiated a campaign called Get One, Give One Worldwide, which is premised on the idea that we who are receiving vaccines don't have to wait for governments to act. We can actually donate to ensure that vaccines reach everybody in the world where they are needed. And so we're actually now activating our own personal networks, our professional networks, our friends, with a simple act of gratitude and compassion for others who are waiting. And we realize that the economic viability, the future globally depends on this. And we need to signal, first of all, to others around the world that we care about them. And we need to let our governments know that we can show you how to do this, because we are actually contributing.
Yeah, but that actually brings up a really important point, because I think to me what the most important thing about this is that you come up with a different initiative and bypass all the holdup that governments are doing, all the backdoor negotiations and things like that, which then really goes to the point when we come up and we put our collective intelligence together, that we do have the power to make the changes we need to make without ever needing anyone at top and kind of giving us the green light. And I do want to talk a little bit more about that, because when we think about making change, creating change, how do we want to live? There are some examples, there are some communities that have taken much more action in getting together and getting better. And I know we actually looked at, when we prepared for this program, so we looked at a couple different little communities: Leesburg in Virginia, Somerville in Massachusetts, Bismarck in North Dakota, and Aurora in Colorado. And when you think about it, none of this have much in common except one thing. I do want to talk about that. And Bob, you're going to explain to us what exactly do they have in common? Why are they considered a changemaker community? What makes them a community? And how did people kind of rally up on this one?
Well, I mean, they all have high density of change-making, sort of attributes. I call them proxy signals, some of which is gathered, I helped gather from people's profiles on LinkedIn. You might think that's a funny place to look, but actually what's interesting is, they're putting things like good for all, change making, climate justice, racial justice. These are words that don't get them a job at Walmart, right? I mean, they're words that they're on the profile because they care about them. There's also activities that you can observe, such as many of them already, have taken a community approach to ending homelessness, and they have actually, each one of them welcome immigrants, and you see each time that kind of the welcoming immigrant activity has led to actually improved economy, lower health, and when I compared this with CDC data for the health these cities, every single one of them had above average, sort of the chronic health indicators, better than average. Handling of mental distress, better than average, levels of obesity, better than average levels of, diabetes. You look at, there's a very consistent pattern, and these communities, from what I've observed, have about 10% of the population or more of change makers. And so, as Kate was saying, and Melanie and Cara, that there's this, community effervescence, this sense of we can, sort of control our destiny, we can take action. And they actually all had lower COVID spread risk. So this is what we're hoping to, discover more. Of course, words on a LinkedIn profile don't necessarily mean they're change makers, but it was just a very consistent pattern across these different cities that led to, like, we need to know more and see how this works.
So do you think there's actually a correlation in terms of that if you have a community where you have more people who are more prone to change making, that they attract other people who are more prone to change making, kind of birds of a feather flock together? Do we have evidence on that? And if we think about this, if we all go more into this idea that we're all wired for change to begin with, couldn't all communities become change maker communities? What stands in the way?
Well, I personally think so. I have friends in Burlington, Vermont, which has amongst the highest change maker density I've seen. And their big challenge now is more people wanting to go to Burlington, Vermont to live post-COVID, because now we have this work from home. And so the prices of homes are going up, so we have to kind of worry about that. But no, I think, if you have a change maker community that, whether there was government regulation or not, they took action above and beyond to stop COVID, spread risk, or they have a more caring, collaborative, community. So I think that's where the money's going to go, where the support's going to go. And I think society is learning that, and even the philanthropists are now saying end of philanthropist, sort of micromanagement, and let's invest in the communities of everyday people that are bringing about, and, as you said, they're the agents of their own well-being.
So caring, acting, and getting going. Is there any final word? We have about very few seconds left. Kate, I'll give you the last word. Any final word you want our viewers to take from this tonight?
I think the final word is everyone is a change maker, and find your passion, find your community, and get going.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think actually a lot of change results when we follow the purpose and then take our place and act on that confidently. I think that would actually get us there. I do invite you, thank you so much for watching. Thank you all for coming on. I would like to invite our viewers also to actually go and read up more on that and really see how you can tap into taking agency and living your purpose and really impact the people around you. Could be neighborhoods, could be communities, could be cities, but make something happen. We see you next week. Have a good night.